It was the kind of night that felt timeless, as if the world outside had simply paused. Michael had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly before him, the headlights slicing through the darkness. The radio played soft, jazzy tunes, a steady companion to the hum of the engine. He didn't mind the long drive. He had always enjoyed the solitude of the open road, the freedom it offered, and the quiet time to think. His car, an old but reliable sedan, felt like an extension of himself, as if the road and the vehicle had become one. But tonight, something felt different. The air outside had an odd chill, and the farther he drove, the fewer cars he saw. It was a long stretch of highway, cutting through barren fields and distant woods, and Michael couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. He brushed it off at first, just the isolation getting to him. But it wasn't long before the quiet of the night seemed almost too heavy, and that strange feeling of being observed grew stronger. He had been on this road many times before, a familiar path between two cities, but tonight it seemed as if the world had shifted around him. The trees along the roadside, their bare branches clawing at the sky, looked more menacing. The empty fields to his left seemed to stretch on forever, nothing but shadows and wind. The headlights illuminated small patches of the road ahead, but much of the landscape remained hidden in the darkness. As Michael drove deeper into the night, a figure appeared in the distance, a person standing at the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just another mirage, the exhaustion of the drive playing tricks on his eyes. But no, there was someone there, standing motionless by the roadside, a silhouette against the pale glow of the headlights. Michael's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers along this stretch, but something about this one seemed off. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his car approaching. As he neared, Michael's gaze was drawn to the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, with a coat that billowed in the wind. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, and his face was obscured in shadow. The man didn't wave, didn't try to flag him down. He simply stood there, like a shadow of the night itself. Michael's foot hovered over the brake pedal. It was late, and the road was empty, but picking up a stranger, especially one standing like that, seemed foolish. He knew the rules: never stop for hitchhikers, especially in the dead of night. But something tugged at him, an unspoken need to help, to offer assistance to someone stranded on a dark highway. Against his better judgment, Michael slowed the car and rolled down his window. The wind rushed in, cold and biting. "Need a lift?" he called out, his voice louder than he intended. The figure didn't answer immediately. Michael's eyes strained to make out more details, but the man's face remained hidden in the shadow of his hat. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and distant. "Yes, please." There was something eerie about his voice, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, though the man stood right beside the car. Michael couldn't quite place it, but the chill running up his spine told him he should drive on. But instead, he unlocked the passenger door. The man approached slowly, almost too slowly, his feet barely making a sound against the asphalt. As the man opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, Michael noticed how quiet he was. The man didn't say a word, only nodded a greeting, his eyes still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the car seemed unnatural, thick with tension. Michael forced himself to glance at his passenger, but it was impossible to see his face clearly. He could feel the weight of the man's presence, but he couldn't quite get a read on him. The stranger seemed calm, his hands folded in his lap, his posture stiff and rigid. Michael swallowed, trying to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice a little shaky, though he didn't know why. The man took a moment to respond, his voice sounding distant again. "Just somewhere. It doesn't matter." Michael glanced at him, then back at the road, the feeling of unease gnawing at him. He forced himself to focus on the road, to ignore the strange atmosphere in the car. He tried to make small talk, asking about the weather, but the man's responses were short, as if he didn't want to talk, as if he had no interest in engaging with Michael at all. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as the road seemed to grow darker around them, the fog creeping in, thickening the air. Michael could see only the dim outline of the road in front of him, the headlights struggling against the mist. He tried to shake the discomfort that was growing inside him, the strange feeling that something was very wrong. But he didn't want to seem rude, and the silence was too oppressive for him to break completely. As the car continued down the highway, something caught Michael's eye. The man's hat had shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the pale outline of his face. It was a brief glimpse, but it was enough. The skin was unnaturally pale, and his features were strangely sharp, almost too angular. There was something unsettling about the way his eyes never quite met Michael's gaze. Instead, they stared out the window, watching the fog outside. "How far is your destination?" Michael asked, his voice tense despite himself. The man's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Not far." Michael didn't know why, but something in the man's response made his heart race. The quiet, the stillness, everything about this situation felt wrong. But still, he pressed on, trying to focus on the road. And then it happened. The man's hand, pale and thin, reached for the handle of the door, his long fingers brushing against the fabric of the seat. Michael's blood ran cold. He didn't know why, but the movement sent a shock through his entire body. It felt like the man was about to do something he couldn't understand. Without thinking, Michael slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the car faster. The engine roared as the tires screeched, the speed increasing as he drove through the fog. "Where are we going?" the man asked suddenly, his tone still quiet, but now with an edge to it. "I'm not stopping," Michael muttered, his voice shaky. "I'm not stopping until we're out of here." The man remained silent, but Michael could feel his eyes on him, burning into the back of his neck. The air in the car was thick now, and Michael's hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He glanced at the man again, but this time the figure had shifted in his seat, his posture even more rigid, and his eyes were no longer staring at the window. They were fixed on Michael, unblinking. A cold shiver ran down Michael's spine, and he could feel the dread building up inside him. He knew he had to get rid of the man, but his mind was racing, unsure of how. And then, just as quickly as the tension had built, the fog seemed to clear. Michael could see the road again, and in the distance, a sign for a small town appeared. The man's presence no longer felt as suffocating, though the unease lingered. Without a word, the man opened the door as the car slowed, stepping out onto the roadside. Max had always been a boy of few words, content to spend his days in the company of his dog, Rex. The two of them had grown up together, inseparable from the moment Max was old enough to walk. Rex, a golden retriever with an infectious enthusiasm and a heart as big as the sky, had been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every failed attempt at riding a bike, and every long, lonely afternoon when Max just needed someone to sit beside him. It wasn't that Max didn't have friends at school. He did, but they were different, more interested in video games, sports, or the latest trends than in anything Max could really connect with. Rex, on the other hand, was always there, always ready to listen, always eager to share the silence in the way only a dog could. It didn't matter if Max had a bad day or if he had no words to speak. Rex was always there, his eyes full of understanding, his tail wagging with an unspoken promise that no matter what, everything would be okay. The world outside seemed to move at a faster pace than Max could keep up with. The days were long, full of homework, chores, and endless responsibilities. But at the end of every day, there was Rex, waiting by the door, his eyes lighting up the moment Max entered. It was the same routine, day after day, but it was one Max could always count on. One Saturday afternoon, Max and Rex went for their usual walk through the park. The weather was warm, the air fresh with the scent of pine trees and damp earth from the recent rain. Max's hands were in his pockets, his mind wandering as he strolled along the path, his sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust. Rex, as always, trotted ahead, his leash slack in the air, sniffing at the ground and occasionally darting after a squirrel or bird that caught his eye. Max smiled, watching his dog's carefree movements, feeling the familiar comfort of the routine. But today, there was something different about the air, something that made Max's heart feel heavy. As they reached the end of the park, Max paused at the old wooden bench by the fountain. Rex came back to him, panting lightly, and sat down at his feet, looking up with those warm golden eyes. Max bent down and scratched behind his ears, as he always did. "You know, Rex," Max began, his voice quiet as he gazed at the fountain. "Sometimes I think I'm the only one who gets what it's like. Everyone else has their own lives, their own interests. But you're always here for me. You always get it, don't you?" Rex wagged his tail in response, his gaze unwavering. Max chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe it's just me being weird, but I don't know what I'd do without you, buddy." The sky was beginning to darken as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the park. Max stood up and stretched, tugging on Rex's leash as he began to make his way home. But just as they were about to leave, something strange happened. A car pulled up beside them, its engine purring quietly. The window rolled down, and Max turned, surprised to see a man staring at him. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice deep and smooth. "That's quite a dog you've got there. Beautiful, isn't he?" Max felt an odd shiver run down his spine. He wasn't used to strangers striking up conversations, especially not about Rex. But there was something in the man's voice that made him pause, something unsettling in his calm demeanor. "Yeah, he's great," Max replied, his voice cautious. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I can see that. How much would you say he's worth? A dog like that, I bet he's got quite a pedigree." Max felt his pulse quicken. The question felt wrong, and he instinctively stepped closer to Rex. "He's not for sale," Max said firmly, his hand tightening on the leash. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but then he laughed softly, almost like it was all a joke. Of course. Just thought I'd ask. You know, there are people who'd pay handsomely for a dog like that. You could make a lot of money." Max didn't know what to say. He felt a knot form in his stomach. There was something about the man's words that didn't sit right with him. Rex, sensing the tension, stood up and moved closer to Max, his body language protective. The man noticed, his smile fading slightly, and he gave a small, almost dismissive shrug. "Never mind," he said. "Just a thought. You take care of that dog. They don't come around like that often." Without another word, the man drove away, leaving Max and Rex standing in the shadow of the park's entrance. Max watched the car disappear into the distance, his mind racing with unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the stranger had been more interested in Rex than he had let on. The walk home felt longer than usual. The neighborhood, once familiar and comforting, now seemed different. Max kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting the man to appear again. Rex trotted alongside him, glancing up every now and then with a worried expression, sensing his owner's unease. That night, after dinner, Max tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in his chest. It was probably nothing, he told himself, just some strange encounter. But the nagging sensation lingered, gnawing at him. He went to bed late, lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. Rex, as always, was curled up at his feet, but tonight, even he seemed restless, his usual comforting presence more jittery than usual. The next day, everything changed. Max woke up to find the door slightly ajar. At first, he thought he had simply forgotten to lock it the night before, but then he noticed something else. Rex was gone. His heart slammed against his chest. He jumped out of bed, rushing to the front door, his mind a blur of panic. He ran through the house, calling Rex's name, but there was no answer. No wagging tail, no excited bark. Only silence. Max's mind raced. He searched the yard, the street, even the neighbor's garden, but Rex was nowhere to be found. Panic clawed at his insides, and as the hours passed, a creeping dread began to settle in. Had the man from the park come back? Had he taken Rex? Max ran through every possible scenario in his mind. He thought of every time he'd let Rex out for a walk, every time they had played in the yard. There had never been any sign of trouble, no indication that someone might have been watching. But now, as he stood in the middle of his empty house, the only thought that consumed him was the fear that his best friend had been stolen. For the next few days, Max scoured the town. He put up flyers, knocked on doors, and even visited animal shelters, asking if anyone had found a golden retriever. But nothing. There was no sign of Rex anywhere. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The once quiet, comforting neighborhood felt like a different place now. Max's world was a haze of worry, filled with sleepless nights and constant searching. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Max received a call. His heart raced as he answered, the voice on the other end cold and unfamiliar. "If you want your dog back," the voice said, "meet me at the old warehouse by the river. Midnight." Max's blood ran cold. He knew exactly where the man meant, the same place he'd driven past with Rex just days ago. His mind spun with thoughts of what to do, but there was only one thing he could think of. He had to get Rex back, no matter the cost. That night, he arrived at the warehouse, the dim moonlight casting long shadows over the abandoned building. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, and every part of him screamed to turn around, to run. But he didn't. He couldn't. It was a night like any other, except that something felt different, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. I sat at my desk, the dim light of my lamp casting shadows on the pages of the book in front of me. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that usually made me uneasy, but tonight it seemed almost comforting. My eyes began to grow heavy, the words on the pages blurring, and I felt my mind slipping into that peaceful, half-awake state, when suddenly there was a flash, a brilliant, blinding light that pierced the darkness and made me jump from my chair. The room went silent for a moment, and my heart raced, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. I looked around, but nothing seemed out of place. No thunder, no storm, just an unnatural stillness. I rushed to the window, throwing the curtains aside, expecting to see a streak of lightning or perhaps a car with its high beams glaring, but nothing. The sky was dark, empty, like it always had been. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. Another flash, but this one came from beyond the trees, far in the distance, bright enough to light up the entire horizon for a split second. Curiosity took hold of me, and I grabbed my coat, heading out the door without a second thought. The night air was cold, biting against my skin, but it didn't matter. Something was pulling me forward. I walked down the quiet street, following the direction of the flash, as though it were a signal, a call that I couldn't ignore. Each step seemed to echo in the silence, the world around me feeling both too large and too small at the same time. As I reached the edge of the town, I noticed something strange. There were no streetlights. It wasn't unusual for some lights to be out, but the whole stretch of road ahead of me was completely dark, as if the light itself had been swallowed by the night. The only illumination came from the distant flashes, lighting up the sky in a sporadic rhythm. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster as I tried to catch up to the source. Soon I reached the woods, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes almost blending with the night. I hesitated for a moment, but then I stepped into the shadowy path, my feet crunching softly on the underbrush. The further I went, the more intense the flashes became, each one sending a shiver down my spine, like I was walking towards something I couldn't understand but was drawn to anyway. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around me, but the flashes of light seemed to guide me, pushing me forward, urging me on. Then, just as I was about to lose hope of ever finding the source, I stumbled into a clearing, and there it was. A figure stood in the middle, bathed in an ethereal glow, their body flickering with the flashes like a strobe light. The figure was tall, shrouded in a cloak that seemed to shimmer and pulse with the light itself. I couldn't make out any features, just the glowing outline, and for a moment, I felt a strange, overwhelming sense of awe. The figure turned, as though sensing my presence, and despite the distance between us, I could feel their gaze on me, an intense, almost probing stare that seemed to reach into my very soul. "Why have you come?" A voice echoed through the clearing, soft yet powerful, like a whisper in a dream. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I had so many questions, but none of them seemed right. All I could manage was a simple, almost desperate, "What is this place? What's happening?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering my question. "This place is not bound by time or space," they said slowly. It is a place between worlds, a place where the veil thins. The flash of light you saw was a signal, a beacon, and now you are here. But the question is not what is happening. The question is, why are you here? I took a step forward, my pulse racing. I don't know. I just followed the light. The figure nodded, as though they had expected that answer. Many are drawn to the light, but few understand its purpose. There was a pause, and the air seemed to grow colder, heavier as the figure continued. It's not an accident that you came. The light is a bridge, a guide, and you are standing on the threshold. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of their words settled over me. The light, a bridge? What did that even mean? And why was I the one who had come here? I didn't understand. Do you want to understand? The figure asked, their voice now tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Something ancient, something knowing. I nodded, despite the fear rising in my throat. Yes, I want to understand. The figure extended a hand, not towards me, but towards the sky. And as they did, the flashes of light grew more frequent, more intense, until the very air seemed to vibrate with energy. Then you must see, they said softly. See beyond the veil. With those words, the world around me seemed to shift. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and for a brief moment, I thought the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear apart. But then, a flash of light more brilliant than all the others exploded around me, and I was no longer standing in the clearing. I was somewhere else. Someone else. I found myself standing on a precipice, overlooking a vast expanse of swirling colors and energies, something beyond imagination. It was like standing on the edge of the universe itself. And in the distance, I saw something. No, someone. It was the figure again. But now they were walking towards me, their form shifting with each step. They were no longer a mere figure of light. They were something more, something greater, something ancient. You are seeing it now, the figure said, their voice resonating within me. The truth that exists beyond the veil, a place where time, space, and light converge. This is where all paths meet, and where every choice you've made and will make unfolds. It is a place of creation and destruction, of beginning and end. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was witnessing, what I was being shown. But I don't understand. Why me? The figure smiled, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Because you were always meant to see. You were always meant to come here. The light you followed was not just a sign. It was a call. And now you stand on the edge, where everything begins. Suddenly, I felt myself pulled back, falling through the swirling colors and energies, faster and faster, until I was no longer in that place, no longer suspended between worlds. I was back in the clearing, the air still, the ground beneath me solid once more. The figure was gone. The flashes had stopped. It was a quiet afternoon when Claire first noticed the smell. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the earthy scent of damp soil after rain. But as she walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, the smell grew stronger. It wasn't unpleasant, just odd. She wrinkled her nose, trying to place it. It didn't smell like anything she could identify in her own home. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as something small, perhaps a misplaced trash bag, or the scent of something left in the fridge too long. But when she looked around, everything seemed in order. She stepped into the hallway, walking towards the basement stairs, the source of many of the mysterious smells in the past. The basement was full of old boxes, forgotten clothes, and random clutter from years of life that had piled up in the house. Claire had always meant to clean it out, but life got in the way. The smell seemed to grow stronger as she got closer, and by the time she reached the top of the stairs, it was impossible to ignore. With a hesitant breath, she flipped the light switch and peered down into the dimly lit stairwell. The darkness seemed deeper than usual, the air heavier, filled with a musty scent that now had an unpleasant undertone. She felt a strange unease settle in her chest. Her instincts told her to call someone, to wait for her husband, Matt to come home, but she wasn't one to leave things unresolved. Stepping carefully, she descended the stairs, the floor creaking under her feet. The basement was cluttered as always. Old furniture was stacked against the walls, and the worn carpet covered most of the floor. As she ventured further into the room, she caught sight of something unusual. At the far corner of the basement, beneath a pile of old blankets and boxes, a patch of wetness had formed on the floor. Claire knelt down to inspect it, her fingers brushing against the damp wood. It was the source of the smell. Something was definitely wrong. She stood quickly, her heart racing. The wetness wasn't just from a spill. It was water, and it was leaking from somewhere. Claire felt a surge of panic, her thoughts already racing ahead to the worst-case scenario. She had heard of water damage in basements, and the thought of expensive repairs sent a chill down her spine. But there was something else nagging at her, something deeper than just the idea of a leaky pipe. With shaky hands, she grabbed a flashlight from the shelf, shining it across the floor and onto the wall. There, she noticed a faint discoloration in the wood. It wasn't just the water. It was black, a stain creeping from behind the stack of boxes. She followed the dark streak along the wall and was struck by the sudden realization it wasn't water at all. It was something far worse. Claire backed away slowly, her mind racing. The unmistakable blackness on the wood was mold, the kind that spread quickly and could be dangerous. The fear that had been lurking at the edges of her thoughts became a full-blown wave of panic. She had never dealt with mold on this scale before. What if it had already spread further into the walls? What if it was poisoning the air? Just as she turned to run upstairs and grab her phone, she heard a sound behind her, a small crackling noise, like the rustling of paper or plastic. Claire froze, her blood running cold. She wasn't alone in the basement. Her eyes scanned the dark corners of the room, her breath shallow. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just her nerves playing tricks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. The sound came again, and this time, Claire was certain it was closer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step backward toward the stairs. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a small, disheveled creature with matted fur and wide, fearful eyes. Claire screamed, stumbling backward. It was a rat. She had never been particularly afraid of rodents, but the sight of this one, with its large eyes and twitching nose, sent a rush of panic through her. She turned, sprinting up the stairs, her hand fumbling for the doorknob. She slammed the basement door behind her, her hands shaking as she locked it. The sound of her pulse in her ears was deafening as she leaned against the door, gasping for breath. Her mind was reeling. A rat. A rat in the basement. It was a silly thing to be afraid of, but in the context of the water damage and mold, it felt like a sign. Something was wrong with the house, something that she couldn't ignore any longer. She reached for her phone, dialing Matt's number, her fingers trembling. When he picked up, his voice sounded distant, almost absent. "Claire, what's wrong?" "Matt," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's something wrong in the basement. There's mold, and a rat, and it's like it's all connected. I need you to come home." Matt sighed on the other end. "I'll be home in an hour, okay? Just don't go back down there, all right? We'll deal with it together." Claire nodded, despite knowing Matt couldn't see her. "Okay, please hurry." The next hour felt like an eternity. Claire paced the living room, trying to keep her mind busy, but her thoughts kept returning to the basement. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it than just water damage and mold. The house had always been old, but it had never felt like this before. It was as though the walls were closing in, the air thick with something she couldn't explain. When Matt finally arrived, Claire rushed to the door to meet him. His face was lined with exhaustion, but when he saw the worry on Claire's, he stepped forward and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Let's go check it out together," he said softly, his voice steady. The two of them made their way down the stairs, Claire leading the way as her heart raced. When they reached the basement, Matt immediately noticed the dampness on the floor and the faint smell of mold in the air. He knelt down, inspecting the area, his brow furrowing in concern. "This is worse than I thought," he murmured. We need to get this looked at professionally. Claire nodded, but her eyes lingered on the corner of the basement where the rat had emerged from. It was quiet now, almost too quiet. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized something else. The mold wasn't the only thing growing in the darkness. Matt stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. We'll get someone to fix the damage, and we'll clean this up. But right now, we need to seal it off. But as he said those words, Claire heard a soft scratching sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the far corner of the basement. She looked at Matt, and in that moment, they both knew. Whatever was lurking down there, it wasn't just a rat. Maybe we should call an exterminator, Matt said quietly, his voice unsure. The cold had always intrigued him. From the moment he first saw the snow-covered peaks from his childhood home, his heart had beat faster. There was something about the unknown, the untamed, the wilderness of the polar regions that called to him, a voice louder than anything he had heard before. While the other children played in the fields and woods, he spent hours poring over maps, studying the expeditions of men like Shackleton and Amundsen, knowing deep down that one day he would be like them. His name would be known not for what he had taken, but for the land he had conquered, uncharted, unexplored, untouched. It wasn't long before his dreams became an obsession. He studied the art of survival, the science of navigation, and the history of the explorers who came before him. His friends and family laughed, of course, thinking it a passing phase, a childhood fancy. But he knew better. There was a fire inside of him, one that would not be extinguished. As a young man, he found himself enrolling in every expedition he could, starting small but always aiming higher. He climbed mountains in the Alps, trekked across the Himalayas, and journeyed to the coldest reaches of Canada. But none of these adventures satisfied him fully. They were steps, mere practice for the journey he had always dreamed of, the polar regions. Finally, after years of preparation, he gathered a small group of like-minded individuals, fellow adventurers who shared his passion. There was Thomas, a grizzled veteran of Arctic expeditions, Lucy, a brilliant scientist specializing in polar biology, and Jonas, a quiet and reliable engineer who could build anything, fix anything, and keep them all alive no matter what. Together, they set out for the Arctic Circle, where their journey would begin. The expedition was to start at the edge of civilization and venture into the frozen wilderness, a place where few had dared to go. The first few days were exhilarating. The air was crisp, the landscape breathtaking as they crossed vast stretches of ice and snow. The temperature plummeted, but they had trained for this. Every step they took felt like a victory, a reminder that they were closer to their goal. Yet, as they delved deeper into the wilderness, the cold began to take its toll. The biting wind seeped into their bones, the endless white landscape turned monotonous, and the isolation started to gnaw at them. One night, as the wind howled outside their makeshift camp, Jonas sat by the fire, his face pale, eyes haunted. "We're not meant to be here," he murmured. "This place, it's wrong. It's not natural." The others exchanged glances, but no one spoke. They all felt it. The suffocating silence, the weight of the land pressing in on them. But they had come too far to turn back. Days turned into weeks, and their progress slowed. The temperature continued to drop, and they battled blizzards, frostbite, and exhaustion. Supplies were dwindling faster than they anticipated. The promise of untouched land seemed more distant with each step, like a dream slipping through their fingers. But still, they pressed on. It was on the 22nd day that the first sign of trouble appeared. They had been trekking for hours when Thomas collapsed in the snow, clutching his chest. I can't breathe," he gasped. "It's too cold." They rushed to his side, but it was clear that the frigid air was too much for him. His lungs couldn't take the strain, and within minutes, he fell unconscious. They tried to warm him, to get him moving again, but the cold had already begun to claim him. By nightfall, Thomas was gone. It was a blow none of them had expected. They had prepared for the hardships of the journey, but the reality of loss, of death in such a harsh place, hit them hard. The loss of Thomas was a stark reminder that the polar regions were not just inhospitable. They were indifferent to human life. But they couldn't stop, Not now. They had come too far. And so, with heavy hearts, they buried Thomas in the snow, marking his grave with the only thing they could, a small pile of rocks, a tribute to the man who had given everything for the dream of exploration. As they pressed on, the landscape grew more hostile. The winds whipped across the ice like 1,000 sharp needles, and the days became a blur of white. They reached a point where the sun seemed to never rise, where they were trapped in a constant twilight. There was no direction to follow, no landmarks to guide them. It felt as though the world had closed in around them, leaving them isolated in a world of ice and snow. Then, one night, while they were setting up camp, Lucy disappeared. At first, they thought it was a mistake, that she had wandered off in the storm. But as hours passed, the worry turned into panic. They called her name, but the wind swallowed their voices. They searched the area, but it was impossible to track her in the vast whiteness. It was as if she had vanished into the snow itself. Jonas, his face grim, turned to Nicobobinus. "This place, it's not just cold. There's something else here. Something that doesn't want us here." Nicobobinus didn't respond. He couldn't. The idea that something, some force, was out there, watching them, felt too insane to consider. But deep down, in his bones, he knew there was something beyond the cold, something far more dangerous. They spent another day searching for Lucy, but there was no trace of her. It was as if the polar wilderness had swallowed her whole. Finally, with no choice but to accept the inevitable, they decided to continue their journey. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As they moved on, the weather worsened. The winds grew fiercer and the snow became so thick that they could barely see 1 foot in front of them. They were lost, and it was becoming clear that they were not going to find their way out of this. In the distance, Nicobobinus thought he saw something. A shadow, a movement, a flicker of light. His heart raced and he called out, hoping it was another expedition, a rescue. But there was no response, only the endless, echoing sound of the wind. Desperation set in. They had no food left, no shelter, and no warmth. The cold was relentless, and each step felt like it might be their last. The harsh beauty of the polar world, the dream they had chased, was turning into a nightmare. On the 34th day, with his body numb from the cold, Nicobobinus collapsed in the snow. He had pushed his body beyond its limits, his mind unraveling from the isolation and the endless bleakness. He could barely move, his strength drained, his thoughts muddled. He knew he couldn't go on. The polar regions had claimed another life, but as his vision blurred, something strange happened. The wind ceased, the snow stopped falling, and before him, in the distance, he saw a figure. Distant, indistinct, but unmistakable. It was Lucy, her figure faint against the snow. The day began like any other, but there was something different in the air, a crispness, a quiet anticipation that hung over the streets. Amer's Cafe stood at the corner of Maple Street, a small, unassuming establishment that had been in the heart of the neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows were fogged from the warmth inside, a gentle reminder of the comforting space that awaited those who sought refuge from the world outside. The cafe was a haven for anyone who needed a place to think, to escape, or to simply enjoy the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Lila had walked past the cafe hundreds of times, but today, for reasons she couldn't explain, her feet led her inside. She hesitated at the door, taking in the familiar scent of coffee beans and cinnamon that always seemed to float out whenever the door opened. She pushed it open, and a small bell jingled above her head, alerting the barista behind the counter to her presence. The cafe was quiet this early in the morning, just a few patrons sitting in corners, their heads buried in books or laptops, lost in their own worlds. Amer, the cafe owner, was behind the counter as usual. His eyes sparkled with a quiet kindness, a man who had perfected the art of hospitality. "Good morning," he greeted Lila with a warm smile. "What can I get for you?" Lila felt a strange sense of comfort in the simple exchange, and the usual stiffness in her shoulders relaxed. "A latte, please," she said, her voice softer than usual. She stepped up to the counter and leaned on her elbows, watching him as he worked. There was something almost meditative in his movements. The way he carefully steamed the milk, how he poured it with precision, and the gentle clink of the cup against the counter when he finished. It was as though he was crafting more than just a drink. He was creating a small moment of peace in a busy world. Amer slid the cup toward her with a knowing look. "First time in?" he asked casually, though his tone carried a genuine interest. Lila nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, actually," she admitted. "I've walked by here so many times, but I never came in." "Better late than never," Amer replied with a grin. "Sometimes the best things are just waiting to be discovered." Lila took a sip of her latte, the warm drink spreading comfort through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she needed this quiet moment, until she was in it. It wasn't just the coffee that felt good. It was the atmosphere, the peacefulness of the space, the sense that time slowed down when you walked through those doors. As she sat at a table by the window, her eyes wandered over the cafe. The walls were lined with shelves full of books, old records and wooden crates, and photographs of places Amer had traveled. Each item seemed to tell a story, adding to the character of the cafe. She felt like she could stay there for hours, losing herself in the warmth and the quiet hum of the room. The door opened, and a young man walked in, shaking off the rain that had started to fall. He was tall, with dark hair and a tired look in his eyes. He glanced around the cafe, and when he saw Lila sitting alone, he made his way over to her table. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice polite but slightly hesitant. Lila looked up, startled at first, but then smiled and gestured to the empty chair. "No, feel free," she said, relieved by his friendly tone. He sat down across from her and ordered his coffee, the two of them falling into a comfortable silence for a moment. Lila noticed the way he seemed to relax the instant he sat down. He wasn't looking at his phone or his watch. He just sat, content in the present moment. It was rare to see someone so unhurried in today's world. "I'm Matt, by the way," he said after a few minutes, breaking the silence. "Lila," she replied, offering him a small smile. "What brings you to Amer's Cafe?" Matt asked, his eyes curious. "Not many people stumble in here by accident." Lila thought for a moment. "I guess I've been feeling restless, like I need a change of scenery, a change of pace." She shrugged. "So I thought I'd finally come in." Amer, who had been cleaning the counter, glanced over at them and smiled knowingly. "Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what the soul needs," he said, his voice soft but firm. Lila chuckled at his words. "I suppose you're right. I didn't realize how much I needed to slow down until I walked in here." Matt nodded in agreement. "This place has that effect. I've been coming here for a few months now. It's the only place I know where I can breathe. The world outside is so noisy, but in here it's like everything stops for a moment." Lila looked at him, intrigued. "What do you do?" she asked. "I'm a writer," Matt replied, leaning back in his chair. "But lately, I've found it harder to write. There's just too much going on in my head. I come here to get some peace. Sometimes I can write, sometimes I just sit, but it helps either way." Lila smiled, a little surprised. "A writer. That explains the whole thoughtful, mysterious aura." She paused, then added with a playful grin, "I guess I'll have to be careful with what I say. You might write about me." Matt laughed, shaking his head. "Don't worry, not everything is inspiration." The conversation flowed easily after that, the two of them talking about everything from books to life in the city. There was a comfort in their conversation, a warmth that grew as they shared stories and experiences. Lila found herself opening up in a way she hadn't expected, drawn out by the easy rhythm of their dialogue. She had always been reserved, but here, in the calm of the cafe, it was different. As the evening wore on, the cafe grew busier. A few regulars came and went, exchanging pleasantries with Amer, while others sat in the corners, lost in their own worlds. The soft clinking of mugs, the quiet murmur of conversation, and the occasional soft laugh filled the space, creating an atmosphere of connection and contentment. Lila looked around the cafe, taking in the scene with a new perspective. She had come in looking for something, she wasn't sure what, but she had found it, in the form of a cup of coffee, a conversation, and a place where time felt like it had slowed down. She realized she had needed this all along, a place to simply exist, without expectation, without pressure. Here, she didn't have to be anything other than herself. "Thank you for the company," Lila said as she stood to leave, the warmth of the cafe still lingering in her chest. "This has been unexpected."